In this video, I'm going to show you what a multiband compressor is, when to use it, and how to actually apply a multiband compression to your tracks. So let's get started. What is up, everyone? Welcome to another tutorial. My name is Daniel and I am the founder of SoundShock. For all of you who don't know, I put out tutorials on the SoundShock YouTube channel every week, and I cover all things electronic music production related when it comes to mixing, mastering, sound design, and arrangement. So go ahead and click the subscribe button and the bell notification next to it so you don't miss when I release a new video. So before I go any further with this tutorial, I just want to let you guys know that I'm going to assume that you have a basic understanding of what a compressor is and its basic functions, as you'll need to have this basic understanding to know what's happening with the multiband compressor. So if you're saying to yourself right now, I don't really know how to use a compressor that well, I don't really know a lot of its parameters, don't worry, you can go ahead and watch my previous video on how to use a compressor, where I go over all the basic functions and go over practical examples of how to use a compressor. So multiband compression. Multiband compressors can seem pretty intimidating. There's all these bands, these knobs, these meters, and all these controls can really put producers off from using this awesome tool. But really, if you have an understanding of what a compressor is, then learning how to use a multiband compressor is really not that difficult. So what is a multiband compressor? A multiband compressor is a compressor that is made up of multiple compressors that are divided up over specific frequency ranges from 20 Hz to 20 kHz. So specific frequency ranges will have their own individual compressor that functions independently from the other compressors. And most multiband compressors allow you to set the certain frequency ranges that each individual compressor affects with the use of what they call crossover points. That really is it. It is just a compressor that is composed up of many different compressors that only affect certain frequency ranges, as opposed to a normal compressor which affects the full frequency range. So why use multiband compression over normal compression? Simply put, I use multiband compression over normal compression because certain sounds and groups of sounds in your mix only need certain frequencies to be compressed. Let's say you have your synth playing. If the mid-range in your synth sounds balanced and is working in your mix, but the high-end frequencies are way too loud, then you do not need to be using a normal compressor, as only the high frequencies are causing the imbalance. Or let's say the mid-range of your track is a little too muddy, there's too many poking frequencies in this range. Using a normal compressor in these situations would fix the initial problem frequencies, but then create an imbalance in all the other frequencies as they were already balanced. Now let's go over the basic parameters of a multiband compressor. Really, they are the same as a normal compressor. Each band has its own set of basic compressor controls: the attack, the release, the threshold, and the ratio. Now there are other controls in a multiband compressor, but I just want to go over the basic ones. So the attack, release, threshold, and ratio function the same as they do in a normal compressor. So if you guys are unsure of what these controls do, go ahead and go back to the previous video that I made on how to use a compressor and go in detail on what these controls do. But once again, these controls function the exact same way as a normal compressor, except they only are applied to specific frequency ranges. So now we know what a multiband compressor is, why we would use it over normal compression, and its basic controls. So now let's go over the 3 most common applications of multiband compression. Okay, situation number 1 of the most common situations in where I'll use multiband compression. And this is to fix volume imbalances of individual elements. So before I go any further, I just want to point out that I am going to be using FabFilter's Pro MB multiband compressor, as it has a very nice graphic display and it will be easier for you to understand what is going on with the multiband compression. I highly recommend getting this multiband compressor, but if you don't want to pay for it, there are a bunch of free options available to you. I put a link in the comments with a bunch of free multiband compressors. I would be using them in this video, but once again, the Pro MB would help me better illustrate the points I'm trying to make in this tutorial. So as mentioned before, individual elements can have certain frequencies that are poking out in the mix. Everything else in the sound is balanced, so we just want to tame a specific frequency range. So let's go ahead and listen to a synth and hear what it needs to be compressed, and we'll go into the multiband compressor and compress it. So as you can hear, there is a lot of high end in this track, way too much. There's too much of a sizzle, and it'll just be way too piercing for your ears. The mid-range sounds solid, nothing's poking out, nothing seems too quiet, so we just want to deal with the high frequencies here. So our first step is to figure out exactly what frequencies we want to compress. So I'm going to do this by soloing the specific band that we were on and moving the crossover point to hear where the brittle frequencies are. So let's go ahead and do that right now. So at about 2166 kilohertz is around where the brittle frequencies are. If we go a little bit lower, you can hear that the mid-range comes through, and we don't want to compress the mid-range. We just want to compress the brittle frequencies, and they stop around 2166 kilohertz. So let's go ahead and set the threshold, attack, release, and ratio controls now. Don't worry about any of these other controls, the range, the output, the look ahead. We just want to focus on the main parameters. And before we go over each parameter, it's important to note that on this multiband compressor, they don't have the milliseconds on the attack and release, which is common in most compressors, but that doesn't really matter here as we're going to be using our ears to decide where everything should go. So for our attack, we're going to want it down at 0, or its very lowest setting. So on a compressor, whatever the lowest setting is, 0.1 milliseconds, 0 milliseconds, I would keep the attack as low as possible, as we don't want any of the original sound to come through. The reason we have the attack this low is because the high brittle frequencies are present the entire time the sound is playing. So we don't want any of the brittle frequencies to be uncompressed. We want all of them to be compressed the entire time. Now for the release, we're going to keep it a little bit higher here. We're going to keep it around 45–50% here. So this will be a longer release. This will probably be around the 200 millisecond range. And once again, since the brittle frequencies are coming through the entire time the sound is playing, we don't really want the compressor to lessen its grip. We want it to be constant the entire sound. So having a longer release will keep the compressors clamped down on the audio on the specific frequencies. And then for our ratio, which is the compressor's strength, we'll keep that around 4.6 to 1, as we want a fair amount of compression here, as once again, the frequencies are playing the entire time. They're pretty brittle, so we want to make sure the compressor is fairly strong here. Now we'll go ahead and play the synth and adjust the threshold. So threshold at around a negative 20.34 sounds like it's taming a lot of the high frequencies here, and there's no longer anything brittle poking out in the synth. So let's listen to it with it off. And then on. So you can see the attenuation happening here. And you can see the little line here, how much it is compressing, how quickly it is compressing, really just how it's reacting to the audio. So as you can hear, we have really tamed those high frequencies. It is no longer brittle, and this will mix in nicely with your track. And now the second most common situation in which I'll use multiband compression, and that is to fix the imbalances in volumes of certain frequencies in groups of elements. Oftentimes when you start building up your track and you have more and more instruments playing, the output of all these sounds together will create imbalances in certain parts of the frequency spectrum, especially the mid-range. Even if the individual elements don't have any imbalances in frequencies, the summation of your instruments can cause this. So let's listen to a group of synths that are playing and that are coming together and creating a muddy mix. And then let's go into the multiband compressor and compress the frequencies that are poking out in the mix. As you can hear, there's a lot of mid-range in this track. The bass coming together with the other synths have come together and created a muddy mid-range. So let's go into our multiband compressor. So first we want to set the crossover points in the multiband compressor to find out which frequencies we need to compress. So I'm going to go ahead and solo this band and search around with my crossover to find out what needs to be compressed. So around 436 hertz down to 20 hertz is where I hear most of the mud. If I go a little bit higher, then I hear frequencies that are not poking out in the mix and that are balanced. So now let's set the parameters for the compressor for the range from 20 hertz to 436 hertz. Let's start with the attack. The attack, we're going to have it all the way down to 0%, or the lowest setting on the attack, as we want the compressor to start clamping down on the audio immediately, as we can hear the muddy mix the entire time it's playing, so we don't want to let any of the original signal through. And then for the release, we're going to have the release kind of high. We're going to have it around 60% here, as we don't want the compressor to release its clamp on the audio, as once again, the frequencies are poking out in the mix the entire time the sound is playing. So we want it to be constant, the compression. And then for our ratio, we'll have the ratio up fairly high here. We'll have it around 5 to 1 here. These compressor settings are pretty strong with more mid-range frequencies and low frequencies. I like to use a little bit heavier of a compression, as these specific frequencies provide the foundation for your track. So having them solid in the mix is very important. You know, if I were to have the imbalance on the higher frequencies, I would have the compression settings a little bit lighter. I would turn down the ratio a little bit and turn down the release, as the high-end frequencies give more excitement and total interest to the track and really give a lot of movement. So I'd want to let those breathe a little bit more than the mid and low frequencies. So now let's set the threshold. So around -20 decibels is where I hear a reduce in the mid-range. It sounds clean, and you can hear all the elements in the mix clearly. So without the compressor, with so as you can hear, much improved, a lot less mud. Now I also want to point out another benefit of multi-band compression. So you might be saying to yourself, so why don't you just EQ out these frequencies? You know, you have your group of synths playing, why not just throw an EQ on the group and take out the mud that way? The thing is, when you use an EQ, you are permanently removing frequencies. With a multi-band compressor, it is only reacting to specific frequencies that pass a certain threshold. So it is not going to be permanently removing frequencies. It is only going to be removing frequencies when they cross the threshold. So when you EQ, you're taking out important parts of other synths when you really don't need to. And with a multi-band compressor, you're only taking them out when they begin to poke out in the mix. And now the third most common situation in which I'll use multi-band compression is to bring out the elements in my track. So if you guys watched my last video on how to compress, then you'll notice that the situations that I use compression and multi-band compression are very similar. But once again, the multi-band compression is frequency specific. So let's say your mix is feeling a little dull, or certain elements in your track are feeling a little dull. I'll use this technique to bring out the elements and give it a little more life. So let's have a listen to an ARP that's going that we want to bring forward in the mix a little bit more. So first, let's find out what frequencies we want to bring out in the mix. And when I'm bringing out certain elements in my mix, I look for the most prominent frequencies of the specific element that I want to bring out. So let's find those and then do the multi-band compression on them. So from around 645 hertz to around 1,303 hertz is where I hear most of the meat of this sound. Now the first thing that I'm going to do to bring out the element is raise the output of the specific frequency range that we just targeted, the 1,303 hertz to 645 hertz. So what that is doing is just raising the volume of this specific frequency range. And we'll do it about 4.3 decibels here. So that's all it's doing is just raising the volume of this specific frequency range. You can have a listen to the specific frequency. Now what I'm going to do is start applying the compressor to it. And the compression is going to reduce the volume the same amount that I raise the volume. Now what this is going to do is give you the sound up front for a very short time and then take it away. So if we were to just boost the volume of these specific frequencies and leave it there without any compression, then they would be too bright in the mix and it would cause an imbalance. So what we're going to do is have the compressor clamp down quickly on this specific frequency range and just give you a tiny bit of the boosted frequency. So let's go ahead and go into our attack. Our attack, we will want this around 15%, a very short attack. We will want some of the boosted frequencies to come through without being compressed. As once again, we do want the listener to hear a little bit of those boosted frequencies before we compress them and take them away and reduce the volume of them. And then for the release, we'll also want that fairly quick, so the compressor releases its clamp on the audio in a relatively short amount of time. So some of the boosted frequencies can come through. If we had the release all the way up, then none of our boosting would come through. The compressor would be clamped down on the audio the entire time and would not bring out the element in the mix. So we'll bring that down to around 15%, and the ratio is good at around 4:1, as this is a good strength for the compressor. Now let's go ahead and set our threshold. And as we're setting our threshold, go ahead and look at the node moving up and down. That will show you how much compression is being applied here. Okay, so I moved down the release a little bit more here, so the compressor releases its clamp on the audio a little bit quicker, and the threshold is set to around -17 decibels. So let's have a listen to the ARP without the compressor on it. Now with. So as you can hear, with this multi-band compression technique, it gives your sounds more presence. Thank you so much for watching the video, everyone. I hope that cleared up some uncertainties that you guys might have had when it comes to multi-band compression and are now confident to go into your own tracks and start using this great dynamics tool. Once again, I put links down in the description for all the different free multi-band compressors. And if you guys want to learn more music production tips and tricks when it comes to mixing, mastering, sound design, and arrangement, go ahead and click the subscribe button right here. See you guys in the next tutorial.